Hey, this is Dylan Holtzauer. This is going to be a critique of this blog post that's on top3dshop.com. Its main purpose is to describe the different kinematic choices you can make when designing a 3D printer, the advantages and disadvantages of them. So, let's go. One of the first things to do is to consider who the audience is. I assume that the main audience for this is going to be experts, as it's going to be intended for people making an initial design of a 3D printer, and because this is really one of the base decisions. Technicians could also gather some use from this article. It's not necessarily for tuning a printer or anything like that. It's really just a base design, but it can help the technician understand the base design to help troubleshoot problems. A non-specialist, a person that's just sort of interested in 3D printing as a whole and not that much into it, might stumble across it, and this may get them interested. And then also executives won't really care much for this particular information, though it could help give them information on the basics of which their product works, and that could also benefit them. It would be good to be high context for this because the bar is relatively low for what you'd consider an expert in the 3D printing realm, just because it's a relatively new industry and people still haven't decided on standards and exact terms that should be used when describing things. So it's best to actually be very specific when you're talking about pretty much anything in 3D printing, so people can work it out themselves. Many people or companies are still doing their own things, so again, it's really just be specific. So it's best to avoid idioms and slang because there's going to be potentially international audiences. You're not only speaking to people in the US, and you're not only speaking to native English speakers, so that's another good choice. So this document actually does manage to avoid idioms and slang pretty well, so that's something it does well. Another thing it does well is that the heft is fairly well applied to what the topic of it is. It's not that long given the importance of the topic, since it's really the base of the 3D printer that you should really be paying proper attention to and making sure you're making the proper design decision for what you're trying to do. And I'm going to look to keep a similar heft when I redesign this article. The convention is fairly good. It's plain, but it's got a nice use of graphics. It's pretty well distributed throughout the document, and it breaks up the text, making it easier to read. The external skeleton is good. It's pleasing to overview, and it's easy to pick up where you left off, with the exception of one thing that we'll get to later. But one thing I also don't like is that the overall main article is shifted to the left of the screen because you've got this index over here pushing it to the left. Maybe that's due to how it functions on mobile. I don't exactly know for this website, but I'll be removing this entirely because I'd prefer this document to be read start to finish. So jumping around through indexes isn't something I want done anyways. So the consistency, it's pretty good. It's not perfect. So for example, exactly in the Delta printers advantages and disadvantages, you can see that there's bullet points here suddenly, and there's no other place in the document where those are used. So that's something that I'd look to fix. I'd just honestly remove these or make sure that all the others have bullet points as well. The expense of it is pretty good. The actual website is built pretty well. It's easy to get to where you want, and then you can connect with others and the readers and the writers through the blog. So that's done well. So in terms of consideration, let's maybe go over some things that it doesn't do well. It doesn't really have a good use of connectives. It jumps around, and it seems like there's an expectation for the reader to choose a specific kinematic system in the right index and just read specifically about that. Again, I'd rather the reader read mine start to finish because you should really be looking at all of your options when designing your kinematic system for the printer, because you don't know if you have the right one already, so avoid doing something that would make it that you just have confirmation bias. Another thing to improve is the first impression of the article. Again, it's mostly that the title just doesn't really give you a good idea of what the purpose of the document is. I like that there's an immediate graphic with nice colorful text. That works well. So in general, I'd consider this document to be considerate, though there is room for improvement in making sure that the purpose of the document is better conveyed, and the general flow can be improved to get the reader through the document. For example, the headers, they're really just, they're not properly indexed. That'll be covered later on, but moving on. So for cultural considerations, political, social, and religious considerations don't really have strong ties to this document. We're not really talking about what it's printing. We're talking about the printer specifically. There should be considerations for economic and technological considerations. So comparing the different costs of the machines and choices, and also considering the required technology for different choices, which is something this document doesn't really do, so I could improve on that. For example, for anything other than a Cartesian, you're probably going to want to move to a 32-bit controller rather than an 8-bit, just because of the extra computing power needed for the kinematics. Linguistics may be a bit of an issue, as it's only going to be written in English, but a lot of people researching these topics, if they don't naturally speak English, they tend to learn it because that's just where the majority of the information is, but there's obviously exceptions. And it's good to be fairly certain about how you speak, but there's also should be room to let the reader make their own choices because, again, 3D printing is in its infancy. All of the best practices still aren't decided. And it's okay to focus on individuality, so using I, things like that, as most people reading this are either in a small company or doing it as a hobby, so they probably aren't going to get offended about terms like I, because they know a lot of people making information about 3D printers are going to be individuals. Moving on to design considerations, the title and headers are fairly well done. Again, it's just little to no alignment for the headers, which makes it hard to separate the content and figure out what exactly it is you're reading if you're not paying complete attention. As mentioned earlier, poor repetition in things like during the advantages and disadvantages of Delta printers. This is the only thing that has bullets. Again, that could be more consistent. There's good contrast overall in this article. Nothing's blurring together and it's not hard to read. And the typography is fine. Again, the font chosen as well. The line spacing is good. And the sidebar index navigation is fine. I just personally don't need it because of how I intend the reader to actually read the document. Resource links are done well. So down here, like linking to Pinterest, it's fairly well contrasted with the page and it's easy to find. And as far as accessibility, there may be some edge case users that are left out, like hearing or visually impaired people. I don't exactly know how they're going to be able to consume this content. Overall, it's got a properly simple design construction given the topic. It doesn't get the viewer overly confused with what their choices are. And at the end of the day, they pretty much got what's here. There are other choices, but this is a general overview, and there are choices that are combinations of these things that don't fit nicely into categories, but this is a great overview and can really just help the reader get running in terms of a choice, because that's really what you need in a lot of cases to actually get started. Just the base choice, and then from there on you can further refine your choice and make revisions and just hopefully get a decent working printer. So that's overall everything I have to say about this document. Hopefully the revision improves on the things that I've mentioned aren't done so well in this document. Thanks for watching.